Tanse. I'm Chris Nachkite. Thank you for joining us for the weekend wrap-up edition of APTN National News. The National Advisory Committee on Residential Schools, Missing Children and Unmarked Burials says the federal government has decided to discontinue its funding. For the past 3 years, the committee has been identifying, locating and commemorating missing Indigenous children who were forced to attend Canada's residential schools. The funding agreement will end on March 31st, and the committee's request for continued funding was denied. In a statement from the committee, they say they are extremely disappointed and are urging the federal government to reconsider. The committee has been providing expert advice, guidance, and support for First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities as they search for missing and disappeared children and locating unmarked burial sites in relation to the residential school system. The committee is led by residential school survivors. They brought together experts in forensics, health, archaeology, archives, and police to aid in their important work. In a statement, Kona Williams with the National Advisory Committee said, "We urge the federal government to reconsider this decision, which we believe to be a giant step backwards on the path of reconciliation." As the daughter of a residential school survivor and elder who contributed to the TRC, this is also deeply personal. APTN News will continue to follow this story. A Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruling released just days before the feds announced changes to Jordan's Principle raised concerns about a large number of items that were being approved as urgent requests. The CHRT said the shift in Jordan's Principle led to expenses being approved for new homes, personal vehicles, and even hockey equipment. Those are among the items Indigenous Services Canada recently announced would no longer qualify for Jordan's Principle funding. APTN's Dennis Ward has more.
In a January 29th ruling, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal wrote there is an immediate need for a shift in Canada's practice. The tribunal is currently looking at interim solutions to address the backlogs and other aspects of the Jordan's Principle program. The tribunal agreed with Indigenous Services Canada that the so-called back-to-basics approach implemented in early 2022 has had unintended consequences. That new approach led to a 900% increase in the number of urgent requests. The tribunal ruling says under the back-to-basics approach, the classification of urgent requests has expanded to include requests that do not align with what the tribunal originally intended. Modeling headshots, trampolines, lawnmowers, and glow sticks were just a few of the 24 examples Canada cited. The First Nations Family and Caring Society cautioned the tribunal to place little weight on these examples, given the lack of context. However, the tribunal says even with added context such as poverty, compliance with city bylaws, etc., the need for a lawnmower could never justify as an urgent need and is questionable for a deadline compliance of 48 hours under non-urgent requests. The panel does not see these types of needs as urgent requests. At an Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs Special Assembly on Jordan's Principle in December, many chiefs spoke candidly about being told by the feds to spend, with some acknowledging some funds were misused.
When you are told by the people that put this program in place, go ahead and spend, and there's no way you could say no to anybody, what do? You listen to them. And that's how it became. There was people, I hate to say this, but a lot of people abused the system where our children could have used it.
The ISK Jordan's Principle operational bulletin posted this week announcing the changes says each new request will be considered on a case-by-case basis.
Canada has mandated significant changes to administering Jordan's Principle in hopes of expediting decisions on requests and addressing the soaring and long-standing demands. APTN's Sarah Bettens brings you the details.
Indigenous Services Canada has announced new operational changes to Jordan's Principle to, in their words, help the long-term sustainability of the program. Now, applicants must demonstrate how the request meets the distinct needs of the First Nations child and how the child experienced gaps, delays, or denial in accessing government services. certain items and services will no longer be approved. In a Tuesday interview with APTN, Indigenous Services Minister Patty Haiju discussed why the changes were needed.
We have to have a better process to streamline requests and to make sure that the information with each request is really clearly identified to, first of all, determine, in some cases, who the child is, and secondly, to determine how that child not having access to that services is in any way delaying or harming their outcomes from a health or a social perspective.
Between 2021 and 2022, there were 614,250 Jordan's Principle requests. In 2023 to 2024, that jumped to nearly 3 million requests, a 367% increase. All future requests will require a letter of support from a health professional, educational professional, or elder or knowledge keeper that demonstrates how it fulfills an unmet need. Requests including the purchase or construction of homes, tickets to sporting events, non-medical international travel, administrative fees, school-related requests will no longer be approved unless funding is required by substantive equality.
We believe at the federal government that every child does deserve equity and access to education supports and to health supports to ensure the best success for that child. But we also believe that provinces and territories have a responsibility within their own jurisdiction to provide equity in education.
Back in December, the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs held a meeting in Winnipeg where First Nations leaders and administrators voiced concerns about the Jordan's Principle system.
In my close to 30 years as an administrator of programs in the First Nations, never been involved in a situation where there were no guidelines for expenditures. There were no guidelines for ineligible activities. There were no guidelines for eligible activities.
Jordan's Principle requests are divided into individual and group requests and are labeled as urgent or non-urgent. In 2022, ISC implemented a back-to-basics approach, allowing the applicant to determine whether the request was urgent. However, this resulted in a 900% increase in urgent requests between 2021 and 2022 and 2022 to 2023. It also resulted in seemingly non-essential items and services, including modeling headshots, gaming consoles, and zipline kits, being classified as urgent. In late January, the father of Jordan River Anderson, the program's namesake, condemned the alleged misuse, aiming his criticism at the First Nation program administrators.
My son's name is being misused and misled. It's sad. We trusted you guys. You were to be born leaders, not to be born fools.
According to ISC, Jordan's Principle has received $8.8 billion in funding to date, and more than 8.7 million products, services, and supports have been approved since 2016. As of December 2024, $6.44 billion was spent on Jordan's Principle requests. Sierra Bettens, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Meanwhile, the claims period for the $23 billion First Nations Child and Family Services and Jordan's Principle settlement will open to eligible children and caregivers next month. Assembly of First Nations National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Nepenak was in Winnipeg last week to make the announcement. Once again, here's Sierra Bettens.
On March 10th, the $23.3 billion First Nations Child and Family Services and Jordan's Principle settlement will open to claimants in the first 2 of 9 classes.
While no amount of money can make up for the harms done or for your childhood, this $23 billion compensation settlement, the largest in Canada's history, is an important acknowledgement of the harm First Nations experienced in this racist system that has broken so many lives and so many families.
Eligible claimants are First Nations individuals who were removed from their homes as children, either on reserve or in the Yukon, and placed into care funded by Indigenous Services Canada between April 1st, 1991 and March 31st, 2022. Their caregivers are also eligible. To apply, claimants must have a valid government-issued ID, a mailing address, and a bank account. The consulting firm Deloitte has implemented a claimant support framework to help simplify the process.
We will have regional liaisons available in each region across the country, and these people will be available to be the point of contact for all the First Nations and their organizations in each region. As well, we have a contact center that will be open every day. Anyone can reach out through various means through that contact center.
Adult age claimants have 3 years to submit their claim. Minors may submit a claim up to 2 years before they reach the age of majority, but will not receive compensation until they are of age.
You do not need to hire a lawyer. You do not need to pay anyone to help you submit a claim. No one from the administrator Deloitte will reach out to you or request your personal information, financial details, or ask you to tell your story of being in the system. If someone does this, this is fraud. Please report it to the administrator.
Those seeking more information may visit fnchildclaims.ca or call the administrator at 1-833-852-0755. Sierra Bettens, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Saskatchewan RCMP have identified the victims involved in that quadruple homicide in Carry the Kettle, Nakota Nation. That story when we come back. Stay with us. Welcome back. The 4 people murdered by a firearm last week in the Carry the Kettle, Nakota Nation in Saskatchewan have been identified. And at the time we recorded this broadcast, Saskatchewan RCMP says there are still no arrests made in relation to the 4 deaths. APTN's Dennis Ward reports.
Saskatchewan RCMP, in collaboration with the families of the deceased victims, are releasing the names to help further the investigation. They have been identified as 34-year-old Tracy Hodamani of the Carry the Kettle, Nakota Nation, 44-year-old Sheldon Cuisance of Zagami, Anishinaabeg, 47-year-old Shauna Fay of Indian Head, and 51-year-old Terry Jack of Carry the Kettle, Nakota Nation. RCMP say neighborhood canvasses have occurred, but at this time, no arrests have been made in relation to the quadruple homicide. Senior Investigative Officer of Saskatchewan Major Crimes, Inspector Ashley St. Germain, says RCMP are actively investigating the tragedy to piece together the details of what happened. St. Germain says releasing more specific details could impact the overall investigation. In a press release, she says rumors can spread quickly. Please remember the loss the victims' loved ones have experienced. Misinformation can impact an investigation by rerouting investigators in false directions. Investigations must follow evidence, and our investigators are trained to do just that. RCMP says the investigation also continues into a firearm incident that took place on the same day as the 4 homicides on Zagami, Anishinaabeg. Keegan Panapikisik was taken into custody in Regina on February 5th and is facing charges related to the firearm incident.
Thank you, Dennis. Last Wednesday, the Saskatchewan government issued an overdose alert after 14 overdoses in Saskatoon happened in just 24 hours. As APTN's Rachel May reports, the city's fire department and frontline workers are urging the public to be aware of the recent spike in overdoses to protect friends, family, and the community.
And I think around last weekend, we started to see a spike. The Saturday, I think we saw 6 or 7 overdoses, and over the whole weekend, I'm talking 24-hour period, we saw 13, 14 overdoses in that one period.
Since February 1st, Saskatoon Fire has responded to 53 overdoses, including 14 this past weekend. Deputy Fire Chief Rob Hogan says the number of overdoses they've responded to has increased since January 1st, 2025.
I looked back for the month from shift to shift. There hasn't been a shift where we haven't had at least 1 overdose or more, which is a pretty shocking.
Hogan says the numbers are alarming as they only include incidents the fire department responded to, not those handled by community partners like Prairie Harm Reduction, PHR.
The reason I say this number is alarming because it's a high number for us, but what's the actual number in the community is probably quite a bit higher than what I'm saying.
When overdoses spike, the cause is often unclear as many factors play a part. However, PHR says alerting the public about a potential bad batch could save lives. PHR engagement manager Miranda Deck says there are 2 drugs that are commonly mixed into other substances that can increase overdose risk.
Fentanyl is usually the biggest one. Xylazine is one that's been more frequent over the last year or so.
PHR offers a safe consumption site with free drug testing to identify what's in a specific batch. Despite over 14 overdoses, Deck says they have yet to receive a single sample off the streets for testing. Deck emphasizes that even if samples aren't brought in for testing, it's still crucial to take safety precautions.
There's also testing strips that we hand out, or you can get in other places, that are a great plan if you're using at home. We also recommend not using alone if you can.
Deck says call 911 if you see someone experiencing an active overdose. Rachel May, APTN National News, Saskatoon.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre announced last week that if elected, his government will build a military base in Iqaluit. He said it would protect Canada's sovereignty and the Northwest Passage from Russian and Chinese interference. F-35 fighter jets and maritime patrol craft would be stationed at the base to protect the region from possible incoming threats, he said. Poilievre also said this will allow for more goods and services to flow in the region. He says the base will require the presence of 4,000 rangers, and he hopes the Inuit will fill this role, citing traditional knowledge of the land passed down to be essential. Poilievre says if he becomes Prime Minister, he would build the base within 2 years of taking office.
The Canada First plan of the Conservative government will build Canada's first permanent Arctic military base since the Cold War. It will be CFB Iqaluit, right here in this community. We will build it in consultation with military experts, local government leaders, and the Indigenous population. Iqaluit already has a functional a forward operating location and a functional airport and seaport that can accommodate the Canadian forces.
This year's Juno nominations are in, and a number of Indigenous musicians have been celebrating all week long. We'll tell you who the nominees are when we're back in about 3 minutes. Thank you for staying with us. This year's batch of Juno Award nominees were recently announced. The A-list includes some of Canada's most successful musicians, including a number of current and new Indigenous artists. APTN's Veronica Blackhawk has more.
BBE, Single of the Year.
This year, several Indigenous artists are nominated for awards in the mainstream categories. The artists Elicipi, Sebastian Gaskin, Andrew Belfour, Snotty Nose Rezkids, Kim Gucci, and Wyatt C. Lewis have all been nominated in non-Indigenous categories. Elicipi for Album of the Year and Adult Alternative Album of the Year on Inuktitut. Sebastian Gaskin, Recording Engineer of the Year on their single Ghost, engineered by Hilk Cortis. Andrew Belfour for Classical Album of the Year, The Large Ensemble on Ispisuin. Snotty Nose Rezkids for Rap Album of the Year and Rap Single of the Year on Red Future and BBE. Kim Gucci for Children's Album of the Year on Shunbe Natsuji, We Are Healing Through Songs. Wyatt C. Lewis for Album Artwork of the Year on Chandler. The Contemporary Indigenous Artist of the Year Award nominees are Adrian Sutherland, Sebastian Gaskin, Kaylee Cardinal, Snotty Nose Rezkids, and Tia Wood. The Traditional Indigenous Artist or Group of the Year nominees include Black Bear Singers, Brianna Lizotte, Cree Confederation, Northern Cree, and Young Spirit. While the Indigenous categories were instrumental to the awards ceremony's progress towards reconciliation, the industry agrees being Indigenous shouldn't limit an artist's inclusion in all categories. I'm Veronica Blackhawk with APTN National News.
Congratulations to all the Juno nominees. You make us all proud. The Yukon Quest is said to be one of the world's toughest dog sled races. The extreme outdoor race includes freezing temperatures, steep inclines, and of course, sled dogs, which need to be cared for throughout it all. APTN's Sarah Connors tells us the heartwarming story behind one rookie musher and his dog team.
They're just puppies, and they're the ones that I ran in the Quest, and it's their first experience with the Quest. And
mushing is in Johnny Cooey's blood.
I was born into it.
The Tetlit-Quitchin musher from Fort McPherson, Northwest Territories, comes from a family of mushers. Cooey is a musher here at Keystone Kennels, just outside of Whitehorse.
All right, another musher coming in, Bib 120, Johnny Cooey from sponsored by Braeburn Lodge.
On February 2nd, he fulfilled a lifelong dream by mushing in the Yukon Quest 175.
Just pulling that hook, taking off from the starting line was such a big relief because we work so hard to get to that point.
The Yukon Quest is not for the faint of heart. Mushers in the 175 raced 175 miles, or 280 kilometers, from the community of Teslin to Ross River in extreme cold.
I can't say it's for everybody because my first night camping out on the Quest Trail, it was about -40 and I slept outside with the dogs, and luckily I didn't freeze.
While 3 dogs had to be dropped from the team for their own health and safety, Cooey finished 5th place out of 7. It's a placement he's proud of considering he only had 2 months to train and all but one of his sled dogs were rookies.
I was really proud of the pups, and they did a really good job, and I think I've done a really good job with them too, so I was really happy with that. Look at that view!
Cooey says the experience also helped him feel more connected to his First Nations culture. Dog sledding was invented by Northern Indigenous people as an efficient winter travel method to haul items across snow-covered terrain. Cooey says it's an honor to retrace his ancestors' footsteps.
And you're living through these trails that your ancestors used to once go through with dogs, and it's just a beautiful feeling. I can't explain it because, you know, it's so fulfilling. And this little lady here, Phoebe, she's a first-time leader, and she just started training 2 months with me.
With his first race behind him, there's now the question of whether or not Cooey will participate in the bigger Yukon Quest, the 450, in the future. If that happens, he and the team will have more training and more experience when competing in one of the world's toughest races. Sarah Connors, APTN National News, Mendenhall.
And that is your headline news wrap-up for the week of February 10th to the 14th. We're back with more news on Tuesday. Make sure to join us for your daytime and evening newscasts then. From all of us at APTN National News, hi miigwech masicho kwana, thank you for watching. And for the Métis and the people of Manitoba, we hope you had a good Louis Riel Day.